Hi, everybody. I'm Tony. That's Brianna.
Hi.
And we are here to talk to you about, well, it was put out there as a grammar review, which it is, but it's a grammar review kind of approached from the perspective of common writing issues. And so that's the way we're going to be kind of looking at this. I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to go through. It does involve, there are places where there are kind of exercises that we will do all together. We don't, it's not like a group, like a small group thing. There's not enough of us to justify that. Even if there was, I wouldn't do it that way. We'll look at those. You'll see what they are. It's basically just, okay, so we just talked about this particular issue, and now let's kind of put it into practice with a few examples so you can kind of see how it works. And so before I get started, does anybody have any questions about what we're doing here before I get started? All right, so let me share. So let me get it going. And here we go. All right, so this is grammar review from the point of view of common writing issues. So let's get started here. All right, so the specific issues that we are going to be addressing: subject-verb agreement, fragments, run-ons, and comma splices, verb tense, pronouns. There's quite a bit in here about pronouns because that seems to be the source of quite a bit of confusion. And finally, there's a little bit about passive and active voice. Okay, so before we get into anything else here, I think it's probably a good idea to do some actual review of some very basic, middle school grammar here, specifically parts of speech. It may seem kind of maybe too basic, but a lot of the issues that we're going to be looking at depend on you being able to kind of figure out what individual words are doing in a sentence, what their specific job is, and what their relationships are towards each other. In order to be able to do that, we have to have a pretty clear idea of the different functions and the different roles that words have within a sentence. So it's worth it to spend a minute just going over quickly the parts of speech. A noun should be probably the first thing that you think of when you think about the parts of speech. Person, place, a thing, or idea. Obviously, again, one of the most common, parts of speech that we have. And in order to have a sentence, you have to have at least one. Realistically, you're going to have more than that, but you've got to have at least one. Related to nouns, in fact, another kind of noun is a pronoun. This is a fairly limited group of words that we know replace nouns that have already been introduced. Adjectives, again, a noun-related class of words. These are words that modify and give us more detail, more information about specific nouns. Verbs, then, the other kind of half of the sentence, right? These indicate action, condition of existence, which for linguistic purposes is the same thing. Again, in order to have a sentence, you have to have at least one noun and one verb, an actor and an action. Again, realistically, most sentences you're going to have more than one, which is why it becomes, I think, particularly important to be able to identify the nouns and the verbs in your sentence in terms of their role in the sentence, right? You have multiple nouns, you have multiple verbs, you're going to need to be able to identify, well, what's the primary noun? What's the subject? And what's the primary verb? What's the predicate? So adverbs, then, verb-related words, as the name tells you. These, like adjectives, modify and provide more information about verbs primarily, although you will see them also modifying adjectives. Prepositions, a large class of words. There's lots of them. They have multiple functions. They seem primarily to do with time and space, but they are also, in a big way, used to help in the creation of phrases that function as other parts of speech, particularly adjectives and adverbs. So that's actually something that we should pause for a moment to recognize, which is that we normally think of, when we talk about parts of speech, nouns, verbs, etc., we think of them as individual words. And that is, of course, true, but we should also recognize that parts of speech can encompass groups of words. Phrases, right? You can have a phrase that is an adjective or a phrase that is a noun. Okay, so it's worth recognizing that sometimes it's not single words. Quite often you'll have entire phrases that are acting as particular parts of speech. Conjunctions, a class of word used to link other words, phrases, or clauses. They can be either coordinating or subordinating. We tend to focus more on the coordinating conjunctions, which are, well, have you ever heard of fanboys? Fanboys is a quick mnemonic to remember all of your coordinating conjunctions. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Those are your coordinating conjunctions. They're the most common ones. Interjections, which some people don't consider a part of speech, but they are exclamatory expressions that's all they do. Things like, oh, right, which is the example. There are other examples that I could probably use, but probably shouldn't. Curse words tend to fall into this category. So again, some linguists don't call them parts of speech. I do. Same with articles, which is the smallest group of words, 3 noun adjunct words, the, an, and a, which have specific jobs that they do only in conjunction with nouns, and they consist of, what we call the definite article, the, or indefinite articles, and a. I think the names pretty much tell you what they do. Okay, so that's your parts of speech overview. There's a few pieces of terminology that I want to make sure we're all familiar with because they're kind of key to what we're doing here. Generally, I try to avoid a lot of grammar speak or linguistic terminology, but there's a few things that we do need to be familiar with. So phrase, group of words that acts as a single part of speech consisting of potentially noun phrases, predicate phrases, prepositional phrases, which act as adjectives or adverbs, and we then, if we want, can refer to them as adjective phrases or adverb phrases. They do not contain a subject-predicate pair. So a phrase is a fragment. A phrase is a part of a sentence. It's not itself a full sentence. A clause, on the other hand, is a group of words containing a subject and predicate pair. Now, they are either characterized as independent or dependent / subordinate. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as subordinate clauses. But independent, dependent, if you can remember that. An independent clause is a sentence, full stop. It is a complete sentence. A dependent clause may look like a sentence because it does have the subject-predicate pair, but it's usually started with a relative pronoun or a subordinate conjunction, which makes it dependent on an independent clause, thus the name. So it's technically considered a fragment. You'll see how this works. I have examples of this. Subject, part of the sentence that contains the main noun and all of the modifiers, all the words that go along with it. Okay, and since we're going to be talking about subject-verb agreement, I will note here that the subject must agree in number with its predicate. That means that if you have a plural subject, you have to have a plural predicate as well. That's what agreement is referring to here. So then the same thing with the predicate. That's the part of the sentence that contains the main verb and all of its modifiers, or all the words that go along with it. And just like the subject, the main verb has to agree in number with the subject. So plural verb, plural subject. Okay, and then one last word, the antecedent, which simply refers to the noun that a pronoun is replacing. All right, so let's talk about subject-verb agreement. As I've already mentioned, in order to be considered a sentence, a construction must have two things: a subject and a primary verb, or what we call the predicate. They must agree in number. This means that if the subject is singular, the predicate or main verb must also be singular. So in order to identify a subject-verb agreement error, you must be able to accurately identify the subject and predicate of the sentence or clause. Since most sentences are made up of combinations of phrases and dependent and independent clauses, most sentences have more than one noun and even more than one verb. So again, it's important that you're able to identify which of those is the subject and which of those is the predicate. So what I have here are some examples, just a few, to help us kind of see what this looks like and how it works. Most of these sentences are preferred term, I think, would be ungrammatical. So these sentences are in some way ungrammatical. They're all ungrammatical in the sense of the subject-verb agreement. So what we want to do here is see if we can identify the subject-verb agreement problem. All right, so first example, there is a bunch of squirrels that raid my bird feeder on a daily basis. There is a subject-verb agreement error in there. Can you find it? Let's start here. Can we identify the primary subject of the sentence? The main noun, the main actor of the sentence. And if we find that too difficult, start with the verb. Your primary verb in this particular sentence, you might think it's raid, right? That raid my bird feeder on a daily basis. This is what I was talking about before. This is an example of a dependent clause, right? That relative pronoun there is your indicator that this part of the sentence is a dependent clause. And there is a bunch of squirrels is your primary main clause. Okay, so this is where we want to look. So raid is not the main verb. The only other verb in the sentence is this small verb is. So that's your primary verb. Can you identify the thing in this sentence that is being, that is ising, so to speak? When you're looking at these nouns, look to the left. Look to the word that comes right before it. In this case, it's of. Now, does anybody know what part of speech that is? Of is a preposition. That means that the noun that comes right after it is the object of the preposition, okay? Which in itself, not that important, but when identifying the subject, it's not going to be the object of the preposition. This prepositional phrase very likely will be part of the subject, but if you're looking for a single word, it's not going to be the object of the preposition. So keep going. You're working left. Of says, oh, that's a preposition, so this is a prepositional phrase, so squirrels is the object of the preposition. So that's not the subject. You keep going, you come to bunch. That's your subject. Okay, now, here's what you have to look at. Is bunch singular or plural? If you said it's a single bunch, then you're right, it's singular. To make that plural, we would make it bunches, right? There are bunches of squirrels. And you see what I just did? If it was bunches of squirrels, you would have to change the verb is to are. It would have to be there are bunches of squirrels that raid my bird feeder, okay? But because it's there is a bunch of squirrels that raid my bird feeder, then it's actually correct. There is a bunch, singular, singular. Now, if you said there are a bunch of squirrels, then you'd have a plural verb with bunch, which is still singular, okay? Now, the other verb we want to look at here as well, raid. There is a bunch of squirrels that raid. Is our primary verb, and we've established that it's singular. Okay, bunch is singular. Raid is a plural verb, right? The squirrels raid. Bunches would raid, but not a bunch. So this is where your problem is. It's not your main verb, it's the subordinate verb. So that would need to be raids. Why is it doing that? Sorry. That would need to be raids. let's look at another example, and hopefully this will become clearer. Sunflower seeds and thistle is definitely the most attractive food for the finches. So again, let's find the verb. How many verbs do we have in this sentence? Let's look. Sunflower seeds and thistle is definitely the most attractive food for the finches. Okay, so there's only one verb, and it's is, again. Obviously a fairly common verb, right? So if is, again, is our primary verb, in this case, our only verb, and here's something I didn't mention. Commonly, the most common way of organizing a sentence in English is the following order: subject, verb, object. Okay, we're not worried about the object at this point. So the subject usually comes before the verb. Nouns typically tend to come before verbs in English. That being the case, once you find the verb, again, work backwards, work to the left, and see if you can identify whatever it is that is performing that action. So if we work backward, what again is the thing or things here that are ising? You have two things, right? There's your conjunction joining these two things, seeds and thistle. Is, again, that's a singular verb, right? And if all you had there was thistle, it'd be fine. Thistle is definitely the most attractive food, but it's not. You have seeds as well. And seeds already is plural. But even if it wasn't, once you put it together with thistle, right? If it was seed, if it said seed and thistle, two singulars, the and joining them together makes them plural. Does that make sense? Hopefully. So it's plural here. You have a singular verb. You have to change this verb. This verb needs to be are. Sunflower seeds and thistle are definitely the most attractive food. Okay, let's look at another example. We're not going to spend the whole time looking at these examples, but I do want to make sure that you've got an idea of how this works. And this one's a little tricky, which is why I have it in here. Either the dog or the cat are going to have to leave this house. If we're looking for the verb, it would be very easy to go right here. To have or to leave. Have to leave, right? That's an interesting little string of verbs there. This is what you want to look at. Are going. That's your main verb. Okay. Now here's the trick. Here's what makes this tricky. You would think that dog, you've got two things here, right, that are going to have to leave. Dog, cat. But this is different from when you have a situation like seeds and thistle. You have to look at the conjunction. And here, that's a conjunction that adds, right? It joins two things. You had one thing, now you have two, right? Either or suggests that you have two things, but you're choosing between them. It's not quite the same thing. So you actually have to pick one. They're not both going to have to leave, so you can't use are here. It has to be singular. These are two singular things. And the either or, keeps them singular. It doesn't make them plural, right? Because that's what either or does. You have two singular things that you're choosing between. So that verb, which is plural, are, needs to change. It should be either the dog or the cat is going to have to leave this house. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Now let's check one more. Let's look at another one. The barking and hissing keeps me up half the night. Now again, find the verb. In this case, it's keeps. That's a singular verb, right? And all you have to do is think about how you would use it, right? Here we have barking and hissing, which individually are singular. But you're using and, so that makes one thing into two things. So it's plural. So you could say the barking keeps me up half the night, or you could say the hissing keeps me up half the night. But if you're going to refer to both the barking and the hissing, it's got to be keep, the plural form. The barking and hissing keep me up half the night. All right, so let's talk about fragments and run-ons and comma splices. These are probably the most common kinds of writing issues that I run into. And fortunately, they're very common. They're also pretty easy to identify and very easy to fix. So first, a fragment is an incomplete sentence or a dependent clause that has been punctuated as though it is a complete sentence, right? So it's part of a sentence that you've stuck a period on the end of so that it looks like a sentence, but once you look at it, you realize, oh, no, that's not a sentence. It doesn't have a subject, or it doesn't have a predicate, or it doesn't have both. Okay, so that's a fragment. A run-on is when you have two or more complete sentences, two or more independent clauses that have been stuck together as if they're one sentence and then incorrectly punctuated. In the case of a run-on, it means there's no punctuation between the two, okay, which is obviously incorrect punctuation. A comma splice is the same thing as a run-on. Two or more complete sentences that have been joined together. In this case, the wrong punctuation is a comma. Okay, so a run-on, two sentences stuck together with no punctuation. Comma splice, two sentences stuck together with a comma. And a comma is, there are only certain situations where a comma is the correct punctuation to use to connect two sentences, and I'll explain what that is. Well, I'll tell you what that is. If the second clause starts with a coordinating conjunction, then a comma is fine. Okay, so this assumes that there's no coordinating conjunction, right? So let's look at what this looks like. This is a brief little paragraph that is made up of some complete sentences and some fragments. So I just want to see if we can identify which is which. So let's start at the beginning. Writing is among the greatest inventions in human history. Does that sound okay? Let's take a look. Writing is among the greatest inventions in human history, period. So you're looking for subject and predicate. Start at the beginning of the sentence. Remember, subject almost always precedes or comes before the verb. And not always, but usually the subject of the sentence will tend to be closer to the beginning of the sentence. Okay, so we go to the beginning of the sentence and we have writing. Single word, writing. The very next word is a verb. It's a really good bet that those two words right there are your subject and your verb. Literally, the first word is a noun. The second word is a verb. And it's a simple verb. It's that common, existence verb, is. So in fact, writing is, that's your subject and your verb. And the rest of it is dependent clause, not even dependent clause. It's all adjectives and nouns. Okay, so your subject and your verb, writing is, that's fine, among the greatest inventions in human history. End of sentence. And that's fine. That is a perfectly fine grammatical sentence. Okay, so we start with that. We look at the next piece, perhaps the greatest. Period. It should be obvious to you that that's a fragment. Okay. It may be because it just feels like a fragment. You can have very short sentences, but if a sentence is very short and feels like, that doesn't feel like a complete sentence, it's worth looking at. In this case, it is a fragment. Not only does it not have a verb, it doesn't have a noun. There's no noun, there's no verb in this sentence. There's an adverb, an article, and an adjective. So it's a fragment. Now, here's the thing about fragments. Typically, fragments are a result of the, composition process. You're drafting, right? And so you write a sentence, and then as you're thinking while you're typing, you think of another thing that you want to include in what you just said, but you've already finished that sentence. So you just make it another sentence. right? It's not exactly an afterthought, but it looks like one. And so you end up punctuating what really should be part of the previous sentence as if it's its own sentence. So the easiest way to fix a fragment usually is to just connect it to the sentence that came before it. And that is what you would do in this case. Writing is among the greatest inventions in human history. And you could use any number of punctuation. You could use a comma, you could use a dash. Comma is the simplest. So comma, perhaps the greatest. Okay, so now that fragment is no longer a fragment. It's connected to the previous sentence, which is what it should have been to begin with. Now, if we keep going, because it made history possible. Now, this one's tricky because it does have a subject and a verb. It made. And if all you had was it made history possible, you'd be fine. That would be a full, complete sentence. The problem here is because. So it's a subordinate conjunction. That means that that clause that we're looking at here, because it made history possible, that's a dependent clause. And by definition, a dependent clause has to be connected to an independent clause. Okay, so the same thing. So you would turn that period into a comma, and because it made history possible, you would connect. And so your first sentence becomes, writing is among the greatest inventions in human history, perhaps the greatest, because it made history possible. Okay, so continuing then, yet it is a skill most of us take for granted. This is a tricky one too, because it starts with a coordinating conjunction. Some people hate it when you start with a coordinating conjunction. Same reason as with a subordinate conjunction, right? It turns it into a dependent clause, and a dependent clause has to be connected to an independent clause. That being the case, you would add this to your previous sentence, which is growing now, right? In this case, I would turn the period into a semicolon and turn this whole thing all the way up to take for granted into one long sentence. Identifying run-ons and comma splices. So the first issue of Action Comics was published in April of 1938. It featured Superman on the cover and in the lead story. Okay, now I'm just going to tell you straight up, that is a run-on. It's two sentences, two complete sentences that have been stuck together with no punctuation. And if you're wondering, it's right here after 1938. The first sentence ends April of 1938. The second one is, it featured Superman on the cover and in the lead story. So the easiest way to correct this is to stick a period there and turn it into two sentences. Alternatively, you could use a comma there. Don't use a comma by itself, because that will turn it into a comma splice. But so if you use a comma here, you have to add a conjunction. So you could say, the first issue of Action Comics was published in April of 1938, comma, and it featured Superman on the cover, etc. Okay, so either a comma with a conjunction or a period is the best way to deal with that. Okay, so that's a run-on. Let's look at the next one. The initial run was only 200,000 copies, but by the 7th issue, the title was selling over 500,000 copies. Every month, one publisher remembered the response of readers was immediate and enthusiastic. So that's another run-on. This comma is fine. Okay, the initial print run was only 200,000 copies, comma, but, so there's a conjunction, so that means it's okay. By the 7th issue, the title was selling over 500,000 copies every month. One publisher, so that's clearly one publisher remembered that. That's a new thought, that's a new sentence. So again, you want a period there. Make a new sentence. I'm going to skip down so I can show you a comma splice. In response, DC Comics launched Superman in 1939. It was the first comic book to be entirely devoted to a single character. That comma there should be a period. That's a comma splice. Two sentences stuck together with a comma. Now, if you want to keep the comma, you would again have to use a conjunction. So again, here you would say, and it was the first comic book to be entirely devoted, etc. Okay, let's talk about verb tense. Verbs indicate not only a specific action, but also the time frame of the action, right? So verbs tell us what is happening, but they also tell us when it's happening, and that's tense. Verb tenses fall into one of three categories. We should all know this: past, present, and future. Future is pretty easy and kind of takes care of itself. We kind of all know how to use the future tense. It's past and present that present difficulties. So you can have varying degrees of time within a single sentence. And the verb tenses get sort of complicated as the number of sort of time frames you're dealing with in a sentence gets complicated. And so we subcategorize these tenses. We call them perfect tenses. They're easy to recognize because they're always preceded. They always come with a helping verb. Okay. Has, right, have, things like that. And you can tell if it's a past perfect or a present perfect verb by looking at that helping verb, right? So a verb with a past tense helping verb, regardless of what the verb itself is, if that helping verb is past tense, then it's a past perfect verb. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. So let's look at some examples. Again, most of these are incorrect. Whenever the professor had called on me, I stutter nervously. Let's look at the verbs. Called, stutter. Those are your two verbs. In this case, it's had called. So you have a helping verb and a verb. So that's clearly a perfect tense. You look at the helping verb, that's a past tense helping verb, right? Had. So that means this is a past perfect verb. Look at stutter. That's present tense, right? That's happening right now. I stutter. This is past perfect. Neither of these is really the correct tense for this sentence. From reading the sentence, it suggests to me that these things are happening at the same time. The professor calls on me, I stutter. So one solution here is to just do the whole thing in the present tense. Whenever the professor calls on me, I stutter nervously. Very simple, right? And appropriate. If you're speaking in the past tense, right? If you're talking about something that used to happen, right? When I was a student, whenever the professor called on me, I stuttered nervously. Again, same thing, both simple past tense. Whenever the professor called on me, I stuttered nervously. So either simple present or simple past tense. You don't want this perfect tense combined with a present tense. And that's just confusing. Excuse me. Okay, let's look at another one. When the speaker has finished, everyone applauded. Now, this is similar to the one we just looked at in the sense that you have a perfect tense and a non-perfect tense. Has finished, that's a perfect tense. Has, the helping verb, is present, so that is a present perfect verb. Applauded, that's a past tense verb. Again, you want to simplify it in the way that we did the first one. It should either be when the speaker finished, everyone applauded. Well, that's really what it should be. There's no other option there. Really. Best thing to do is just simple past tense. When the speaker finished, everyone applauded. Right? The reason I'm talking about verb tense is because obviously it's a common issue, right? I have seen student papers where the verb tense is kind of all over the place, right? Changes from past to present to past in the same sentence sometimes. And a general rule of thumb, for the most part, is to pick a tense and stick with it. For example, let's say writing in the social sciences. If you're writing about a study that has already taken place, you'll write about it in the past tense, right? We did this, and then we did this, etc. Oftentimes, those kinds of articles or papers will be written in the present tense. Even in my discipline, in the humanities, in English, we often write about historical subjects in the present tense. We call it the historical present, right? Even though, Shakespeare is long dead, we will talk about what Shakespeare does or says in a particular play or poem, right? He's not doing it now, it's past tense technically, but we do have this thing called the historical present. The point is that it's usually best to just pick a single tense and stick with it. Let's look at one more. I loved cats since I was a little girl. This is a sentence where you actually want a perfect tense. Okay. And you want a present perfect tense. If you say, I have loved cats since I was a little girl, have loved, present perfect, that says this is something that started a long time ago and is still happening today, right? So what it would say, I have loved cats since I was a little girl. What that says is, I started loving cats when I was a little girl, and I still do. Okay, we say these things all the time. I think sometimes we just don't quite know why we're doing it. One more example, because it's another perfect tense that I want I want you to have a sense of what this is. He just crossed the street when the runaway car had crashed into the building. So you've got a past tense and a past perfect tense verb here. And here's the thing about past perfect. Past perfect you use when you're describing two events, usually, and you need to indicate that one of them happened before the other one. And the past perfect is the one that happened first, right? So you have to look at this sentence and ask yourself, what happened first? Did the crossing of the street happen first, or did the crashing into the building happen first? In this case, it's the crossing of the street. He crossed the street, then the car crashed into the bank building. So this has been marked as a past perfect, and it's the wrong one. It should be, he had just crossed the street when the runaway car crashed into the bank building. Okay, it may be that you hear that and your ear just tells you, yeah, that sounds right, and that's okay. You learn to trust your ear, right? Most of the time, because we're all speakers of English, right? Most of the time we can hear when something doesn't sound right. We might not know why, but we can hear it enough to be able to make us stop and look more closely at the sentence and make us go, okay, so what is it that's going on here? In this case, it's the fact that the helping verb needs to go with crossed and not crashed. So we're going to skip. We're going to talk about pronouns, special words that have unique properties and problems, including pronoun agreement issues, vague pronoun references, and issues with respect to correct pronoun function. I'll talk about all of this stuff. All right, so let's talk about pronoun agreement. In the same way that a subject has to agree with its verb in terms of number, pronouns have to agree with their nouns, but there's more to it, right? Because pronouns, there's four things that we can talk about with respect to pronouns: their number, their person, their gender, and their function, which you'll sometimes hear referred to as case, which is a little too technical, I think. Function is fine, right? When you're talking about pronouns, they all have those different qualities. Pronouns are either singular or plural. They're either first, second, or third person. They're either masculine, feminine, or neutered. And they are, in terms of function, they're either the subject or the object. Okay. All four of those things we need to consider. In the case of pronoun agreement, we're just looking at we're looking at all of number, person, and gender, but number is most important, right? Plural pronouns, generally speaking, need to go with plural nouns. So here it is. If a noun is naming a person of known gender, right? So if you're using a pronoun to refer to a noun that we know is masculine or feminine, then use that pronoun. Those pronouns should be using the appropriate gender, right? In other words, if you're using a masculine pronoun to refer to a person identified as female, then you have a disagreement between the noun and the pronoun, and you need to correct that, right? Here's where it gets fun. If you have a noun where you're referring to a person of unknown gender or non-binary gender or fluid gender or any of the myriad ways we have of defining gender now, then you're actually going to use what we would normally identify as a plural pronoun to refer to that singular noun. Now, there was a time when we being English teachers and writing specialists would have told you not to do that. That is no longer the case. Okay, like everything else that's alive, language evolves. And we have lived through a period in which we've actually seen the English language evolving. And the way it's evolved is that it has adopted these plural pronouns, they, them, themselves, their, theirs, to be used in certain situations as singular. Right? And you should all be familiar with this, right? We know that there are people who don't use masculine or feminine pronouns. They use they, them, themselves, etc. And that's perfectly fine. That is we now consider that to be grammatical. All of the writing handbooks will tell you when you're referring to a person of unknown or non-binary gender, use they, them, themselves, and so on. And so it's all perfectly legitimate and correct and grammatical. You'll also notice, I've been seeing this quite a bit lately in the last couple of years. You'll see people using themself instead of themselves. They've singularized that plural form. It's not common, but you do see it occasionally. But don't think that using they to refer to an individual is incorrect or ungrammatical. It's not. It's perfectly acceptable, good grammar to do that. Okay, let's talk about vague pronouns. These can take a couple of forms. One is they refer to an unspecified number of antecedents. So here's a sentence. Spike's hobbies include fishing, skiing, and zombie hunting. It requires a lot of money for good equipment. Now, the pronoun that we're concerned with here is it. It's vague because we don't know specifically which of these things requires a lot of money for good equipment. Could be any one of those, could be all of them. So here's what we do. Spike's hobbies include fishing, skiing, and zombie hunting. These pursuits require a lot of money for good equipment. This indicates that the pronoun refers to all three of the antecedents. So you just have to be more specific. Second example, Spike's hobbies include fishing, skiing, and zombie hunting. Zombie hunting requires a lot of money for good equipment. This indicates that which of the specific antecedents is being referred to. In this case, it's the zombie hunting. Other kind of vague pronouns is when you have a pronoun that appears to be referring to nothing. There's no noun that you can identify that it seems to be referring to. So contrary to their promise not to hurt anyone, the zombies tried to eat the brains of all the people in the room. That surely surprised and angered them. Your pronoun here is that. When you read that, when I read that, my immediate reaction is, what surprised them? There's no obvious noun that it's referring to. So look at the way we correct it. Contrary to their promise not to hurt anyone, the zombies tried to eat the brains of all the people in the room. That attack surely surprised and angered the people. This clarifies what that is referring to. All right, let's talk about pronoun function. Don't be put off by all of the information on this slide. It's just really there for you to refer to. Pronouns change their form depending on whether they are the subject or the object of a sentence or a clause. Okay. So here's some rules to remember. The subject performs the action. Okay. The object receives the action. Okay. So one way to think of it is that the subject does something for the object or to the object. Okay. And so here's how it falls together. These pronouns, I, you, he, she, it, are subject forms, singular subject forms. They perform the action for me, you, him, her, or it. Singular object forms. Plural subject forms, we, you, they, perform the action for us, you, them. Plural object forms. And it's broken down here, right? First person, second person, third person, singular and plural. So subjects, I, you, he, she, it. Objects, me, you, him, her, it. And then the same thing with the plural subjects and objects, okay? The only pronoun that does not change its form is the second person, right? Look at the second person here. Singular, plural, subject, object, it's all the same. You, right? It only changes when it becomes possessive, which are not represented here, and then it becomes your. But otherwise, second person is always the same. It's always you. Note also that the third person plural forms, that's here, third person, they, them, they only change for function and not for gender. Okay, let's see what I'm talking about here. Buffy and me both went out to fight the zombies. This is what this looks like. Okay. This is easy to figure out. Take out Buffy. If it was just you in this sentence, you wouldn't say me went out to fight the zombies. You'd say I went out to fight the zombies. And that's what it needs to be. Buffy and I both went out to fight the zombies. Right? Because it's a first person singular subject. Right? It's the beginning of the sentence. The verb went out or went comes after it. So it's not an object. It's the subject. So you go with I. They destroyed the zombies just for she. Now, objects are much more likely to be towards the end of the sentence, so it's a good bet that that's an object, she. They is fine. If it's an object, it's a third person singular feminine object. They destroyed the zombies just for her. She gave I a crossbow to kill zombies. Obviously, no one's ever going to say that. She gave me a crossbow. That happens to be the object form. And so on. The zombies had they over for dinner? No, we don't say that. The zombies had them over for dinner. Haha. See what I did there? It's a funny joke, right? Okay. Willow and him are going out to hunt zombies tonight. Take out Willow. You don't say him is going out. You'd say he is going out, right? And you wouldn't just move it. You wouldn't go him and Willow. A lot of people would do that. But doesn't solve the problem. It's got to be he. All right, let's talk about relative pronouns. These are very common. They're very easily confused, which is surprising because they're really, really easy. Okay. These are the relative pronouns. Who, whom, that, and which. That's it. Those are your relative pronouns. Most easily confused pronouns. Relative pronouns need only to be considered in terms of their antecedents. What are they referring to? That and which refer only to things and objects. Who and whom, refer only to people. It's that simple, okay? Here's examples. The crossbow that you ordered to kill zombies arrived today. The crossbow which I need to kill zombies arrived today. That and which, they're both referring to things, the crossbow in that case. The woman who read my zombie apocalypse novel is a professional editor. I've known her since graduate school. I asked a professional editor whom I have known since graduate school to read my zombie apocalypse novel. Who and whom in both cases referring to the woman, the editor, those are both people, so we use who and whom. It's that simple, okay? If your pronoun, your relative pronoun is referring to a thing or an object, use that or which. If it's referring to a person, use who or whom. How do you differentiate between the two? It's actually pretty easy. Who and whom are further distinguished by their function. Who is the subject form, whom is the object form. In general, the word serving as the subject, and I've said this before, is positioned just before the verb. So if the word immediately after the who is a verb, use the subject form, who. If the word immediately after the who or whom is a noun, use the object form. So here's an example. The woman who read my novel is a professional editor. Read is a verb. So go with who. I asked a professional editor whom I have known since graduate school to read my novel. I is a noun, pronoun. So you go with whom. That and which then have slightly different uses as well. Which is typically used for non-essential information, which means it's usually set off by a comma or a comma, as it is in this sentence that we're looking at. Right? Which is typically used for non-essential information, comma, which means it is usually set off. Okay. Here's an example. His most recent zombie book, which I bought and read as soon as it was published, was very enjoyable. Okay, that is interesting, but not necessary information. You don't need to know that I bought and read it as soon as it was published. So his most recent zombie book, which I bought, so you need the comma and the which. But his first book is the one that I most often recommend to my students, okay? You need this information, the one, which one? It's the one that I most often recommend. So there's no commas there and you use that. So let's talk about active versus passive verbs. Passive voice. All action verbs are said to occur in one of two voices, active or passive. Most English sentences by default are active constructions in which the subject or the actor performs the main action of the sentence and the object receives the main action. We've already talked about that. So the subject comes before the verb, which comes before the object. And so it looks like that. Subject, verb, object. The subject, noun, performs verb to the object, noun. So here's an example. Antonobia tracked the zombie to a cemetery outside of town. That is an active voice sentence. The subject here, Antonobia, is performing the action of tracking for the object, the zombie, right? Antonobia tracked. Subject, simple verb, past or present tense. Passive constructions reverse this relationship. They have the subject and object switch places so that the object now comes before the verb and the subject comes after it. Or even more commonly, they remove the subject altogether. What does that look like? The zombie was tracked by Aunt Zenobia to a cemetery outside of town. So the object, the zombie, which is receiving the action of tracking from the subject, Aunt Zenobia. Oftentimes you'll see when it's reversed like this and you still have a subject, you'll see the by, right? The zombie was tracked by Aunt Zenobia. They often look like this too, was tracked, right? It'll be a compound verb like that. Even more commonly, we will remove the subject altogether. And there's a reason for this. The zombie was tracked to a cemetery outside of town. The zombie receives the action from an unknown subject. So this is actually really useful in situations where we don't know who did it. So anybody who's in, criminal justice will probably use this kind of thing all the time, right? We use it in the sciences a lot too. Not because we don't know who did something, but because we want to de-emphasize the person doing it and want to emphasize the thing that was done. That's why you do it. So you'll sometimes hear people say to you to avoid passive verbs at all costs, right? Every verb must be active. Every sentence must be in the active voice. No, not really. Sometimes passive is what you want. That second sentence, the zombie was tracked to a cemetery outside of town, that's exactly what you want to do if you don't know who tracked the zombie. Okay, so passive verbs are not always wrong. They have a use, they have a purpose. Passive constructions are not technically ungrammatical. Most editors and composition teachers do expect you to keep your verbs active. Passive voice constructions should be used sparingly and only when there's a good reason. So there you go. When you want to place the emphasis on the action rather than the actor, or when you don't know who's performing what. Just a little bit more. Passive constructions are usually structured in the following way. A subject followed by some version of a to be verb followed by a past participle, a verb that typically ends in ed most of the time, but could look somewhat different. In the example we just saw, it was tracked. Okay. To make a passive verb construction into an active one, take the nouns on either side of the verb and flip them. And then take out the helping verb. So instead of was tracked, it's tracked. Instead of the zombie was tracked by Aunt Zenobia, flip the nouns, Zenobia and zombie, take out the was, and it becomes Aunt Zenobia tracked the zombie. And that's an active construction. To identify passive constructions, you got to be able to tell which noun is the subject. So in other words, you have to be able to identify the noun that's the primary actor of this action in the sentence, which takes us right back to the beginning and the parts of speech and why it's important for you to know what those are and to be able to identify what job each of those words has within the sentence. And that, my friends, is the end of my presentation.